When you ask most people to think of a great leader, the type of person that springs to mind is that magnetic, charismatic, inspiring leader, usually someone famous or fictitious. So far this year, we've heard some excellent perspectives on issues like introversion, emotional intelligence and emotional agency, on ethics, authenticity, overcoming fear, and how each of these things can be leveraged to make you a better leader. But I've maybe unconsciously been avoiding the discussion about charisma itself, in part because I'm somewhat cynical about it, perhaps because of my own bad experiences with leaders who've relied upon an often skin-deep persona rather than the deeper, authentic kind of leadership that we talk about on this podcast. Well, that avoidance ends today. In last week's episode, Douglas Squirrel and I chatted about the importance of productive conflict, which has inspired me to tackle the discussion on charismatic leadership. To help me do that, I am joined today by a communication strategist, executive coach, and expert in applying charisma to improve people's influence, leadership, and confidence. His name is Sebastian Walls, and he's from The Art of Charisma. If you'd like to learn more about today's topic, make sure you listen to the end of this episode because there will be many links and places where you can go to get more information. This is Leading with Integrity Leadership Talk, the podcast for first-time managers who are working in tech-driven businesses and teams and who want to be more effective, people-first leaders. Each week, you will learn the crucial strategies, mindsets, and practical tips that successful modern leaders follow to be engaging, ethical, and authentic managers who get the best from their teams. And we'll achieve all of this via weekly conversations with leaders, with leadership experts, entrepreneurs, and business owners, people who have already walked this path and have some amazing insights to share, with an added sprinkling of occasional solo episodes and some group chats where we'll have multiple guests. My name is David Hatch, and I will be your host. And leadership has always been a passion for me. After a career spent in a series of small businesses during 15 years in the aerospace industry, 5 or 6 of those at the end of that career were in a space startup in the UK, so trying to launch satellites into orbit, very cool stuff. And through all of that experience, I learned that the secret to successful management is in the ability to apply great leadership. And in turn, the secret to great leadership, it's all about your integrity, putting people before profits.
Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Leadership talk for the modern manager. With your host, David Hatch.
Well, Sebastian, thank you for joining me today. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for welcoming me on here, David. I'm really excited about this.
Yeah, me too. It's going to be a good conversation. Hopefully not too controversial, and we'll see how we get on.
Well, you know, it's so funny you should say that. The word that came to mind was controversial, but hopefully we'll go through deep into the topic which I'm passionate about, which is charisma, and we'll get into the nitty-gritty of how people can either improve their charisma and maybe perhaps go through some of the myths around it as well. So I'm sure there'll be lots of value in this one.
Yeah, I'm sure there will as well, and I certainly hope there will be. So, we'll see how we get on. So, best place to start, which I do every week, is I'm just going to give the control over to you to introduce yourself, tell the listeners a bit about what you do and why you do it.
Oh, perfect. Wow, what a great question to start off with already. For me, I'm going to start at the last bit and then we'll go forward from there. So, years ago, I was probably the most hated person in the UK. That's right. I was a used car salesman. You know, up there with double glazing salesmen, up there with estate agents. I was probably in that category of the most hated person in the world. And what I found is that over my time as working in sales, being able to build relationships, build trust, being able to develop deep and meaningful connections with people, I understood that it wasn't about the products. It wasn't about the je ne sais quoi of the brand. It was all down to your internal magnetism, your charisma, how you're able to connect with people. And that projected me to having a lot of success within sales, within leadership. And from there, I've been able to deconstruct charisma and become incredibly passionate about it, reading everything from what the Greeks and the philosophers said about it, right up to modern day leaders about what their theory is around charisma. And so my name is actually Sebastian, you mentioned it early on. And I run training, workshops, coaching all around how your team can build charisma.
Interesting. So, most hated person in the UK. I don't know. Is that unfair to car salesmen?
Well, that's true. That's true. I always think when I think of car salesman, I think of the classic. I don't know if your listeners are aware of the sort of only fools and horses, the sort of Del Boy attitude. And whilst, yes, there's a few tricks of the trade, there's just something really likable about that character. That's just something that people remember even after the show's long gone. And so, yeah, I think the idea is that sleazy car salesman, you think. And I'm sure we could even put it into leaders. You know, we can always think of that really cheesy, really slick, sleazy manager. Even if you look at shows like The Office, either Michael Scott or David Brent, whilst they had that sort of cheese factor, there's something quite charming about them, something quite endearing and quite likable about them. But yeah, with the used car salesman, I guess they get a bit of a bad rap. So maybe you're right. Maybe I'm being a bit too harsh there.
Yeah, I think there's the stereotype, isn't there? But certainly, I bought a used car last year, and the salesman then was very friendly, very good, I think, very authentic, and building that relationship. And we ended up having quite a good chat on a number of occasions in the end. And obviously he was doing a sales job on me because that is his job. But at the same time, I didn't feel like I was dealing with that sleazy sort of used car salesman that we've all come to expect. So maybe the world's moving on. Who knows? Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting place to start. You mentioned a couple of things there that I actually really liked, which is around, you said authenticity. I think whether you're a used car salesman, you're a mother trying to get their toddler to go to bed, or you are a leader at a Fortune 500 company, this authenticity, this idea of having influence over people has to come with authenticity. It has to come with being genuine with people. You mentioned conversation. A huge part of charisma is having deep, meaningful conversations. I always think back to like a hairdresser, when they're like, oh, well, where you got any holidays planned? Yes, it's nice pleasantries and it's good small talk. However, it's not the deep, meaningful conversations that we want to talk about. And I always think about, we don't really remember, something that I always learned when I was in the motor trade was that people don't really remember what we say. People don't remember necessarily the words that we're using. They remember how we feel. So we remember them showing an interest and us feeling warm. We remember the jokes they said because it made us laugh. These emotions are really important, not only in building deep connections outside of work in your personal life, but in your professional life as well. So yeah, it's going to be a real interesting podcast, this.
Indeed. And on that note, let's kick off then with the big question. Charisma is something it has a good and bad reputation, I think. It's something that is often been misused by some of the bad actors. There's some big examples we could look to from history at a geopolitical level even. But it's also, on the other side, been associated with some of the greatest leaders that mankind has ever known. People like Barack Obama, Winston Churchill, perhaps controversially, Nelson Mandela, just to name a few. So I think the challenge for us as leaders and as followers is being able to know the difference. How can we spot the good people, the great leaders who are applying this skill of charisma in the right way and for the right reasons, and tell them apart from those bad apples?
Yeah, I actually really love that question. It actually reminded me right at the beginning where the Greeks, when charisma was first trying to, put into words, the Greeks described it as a divine gift. And I think that's part of where the bad rep has come from, because it makes it feel like the supernatural power, this thing that you can't actually talk about, you can't touch, you don't know exactly what it is. But actually, if you break it down, you can actually see it happening. And those great leaders you said all use those characteristics about those soft skills that, when applied, build up to charisma. Now, of course, there's people there. I kind of put it in the same camp as money, power, science, success. That those qualities can be used for good, but it can also be used for evil. And the best way to use it is this idea of being genuine and authentic with people. Now, humans are really actually good lie detectors. You call it your gut instinct. So when someone is telling you something, you can really sort of pick up those nuances. A great example in the workplace is when a manager, maybe perhaps you've done a terrible job, David. You've done a terrible job for whatever reason. I'm your manager and I'm like, God, I don't want him to be feeling down. So I'll say, David, you did a great job. You did a great job. But you know yourself. You know you made a mistake. You know you didn't do right. So that's not really coming across as genuine. And you can tell, and your staff, your employees can pick up on these things. A better thing to say would be something along the lines of like, look, don't worry about it. We all make mistakes. It's fine. It's not going to be the end of the world. I know you're going to come and bounce back. It has the exact same effect, but you're being much more genuine, much more authentic with it. It's the exact same way. A way to increase your likability with somebody is to use a phrase which is, I was just thinking about you the other day. Because we all have this deep insecurity of wanting to be liked and wanted by somebody. So if you turn to someone and say, David, just before this, I was actually thinking about you the other day. I was thinking about leadership and I was thinking about this, you feel with that nice, warm, fuzzy feeling. However, if I wasn't actually thinking about you and I just threw out there, oh, I was thinking about you, it kind of comes across a little bit cheesy. The same with a fake smile. We can spot a fake smile, that sort of really cheesy, really stiff smile. It's the same way, you hear people crack a joke and the fake laugh. It's just so canned. So the best things that they do is they do it authentically. That's the main thing. But also, if we were to break down the components of the people that you mentioned, they use great first impressions. They use a great first impression. They use something called the chameleon effect, which is when they mirror what the situation is. They change themselves to how that situation is. We look at Barack Obama as an example you just gave there. How he approaches a situation like meeting Jay-Z and Beyonce at the White House is going to be completely different to how he will meet Putin, in Brussels over a political debate. It's going to be completely different. Being able to tell great stories, Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King, they tell these captivating stories. Winston Churchill tell these amazing stories that convey emotions, ideas, concepts, and that's incredibly important when it comes to charisma. Now, going back to your example of the car salesman, great conversations. I always see these people in chat shows and they tell, they're having great engaging conversations, not only with the host, but the audience are getting involved in it as well. So these are things that I look for in people using charisma for good and the skills that they can use as well.
So setting aside that grand scale of things and bringing it maybe down to a more sort of down to earth, more routine level, what would you say a charismatic presence looks like in a day-to-day office environment? And why is it such an important skill for a manager to develop?
Charisma is a fantastic skill. We always think of it as a personal attribute, like maybe talking to someone in a bar or building a social life. But actually, we very rarely see charisma as a job skill. And it's probably the most underrated job skill out there. We think of hard skills like coding or building or whatever it could be, but those soft skills of charisma, they've been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, even through all the technology changes, such as, the internet and in the future, AI. Soft skills will always be necessary because you'll always have to interact with people in some capacity, whether that's your customers, your staff, your employees, your investors, whoever it could be. You're still going to have to deal with people at the end of the day. So it's incredibly important. In a day-to-day, I always like to say it's incredibly subtle and it happens over a long period of time. It's those mornings where you walk in and you say, hey, Sandra, how was your weekend? How did you get on with the kids? And showing a genuine interest in their life. It's about giving someone a compliment right at the moment where they need it. It's about, I suppose, making that really good first impression, conveying your ideas, and some of the stuff that we talked about, storytelling, first impressions, conversations, confidence, emotional intelligence. And they can take different forms in the day-to-day. Yes, we've talked about there, like saying good morning and being present and being engaging and talking to them. That's one of the ways. But even also when you're with clients, people buy from people. So if you're somebody who's going for the hard sale, talking about the product, talking about the spec, whilst that might be interesting and it might have a bit of value at some point, the key thing is to get under the skin of your staff and your customers and really get to know them and be interested in what they've got to say. So that's the key elements to it. Now, whilst we can all, say, how was your weekend? And, oh, the weather's terrible. You're not building those deep connections. It happens over a long period of time. It happens in the meetings. It happens at the coffee mornings. It happens at the after work drinks. So it's important that you're present with this as well and consistent.
Really like all of that. And one of the reasons why I like all of that is that I see so many parallels with the idea of leadership itself, and in a couple of ways. So there's one kind of concept of leadership that I really resonate with, is the go-to phrase, isn't it? Which is this idea of everyday leadership, where leadership is not about as much of the big gestures, the grand strategy, the big inspirational speeches and all these things. I mean, those are important. But actually, at a fundamental people level, leadership is about those everyday interactions, exactly the kind of things you just described. It's about what can you do to make your people feel seen, feel valued, feel supported, and little things. Just as you say, someone's having a bad day, bring them a cup of tea, see if there's a bit of work you can take off their shoulders that day. It's that small stuff that, much like building that charismatic presence, you're building that everyday leadership. And another parallel I see, which is perhaps a different conversation we can have in a moment, is this question of, is charisma a skill or is it a natural ability? And then again, it's a parallel, because that's a debate in leadership as well. Are you born with it? Is it like hair? Or is it a skill? Is it something you learn and pick up? Now, I firmly believe it's the latter. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that argument in the field of charisma and leadership, actually.
Well, just to go back so we can go forward just there, one of the things that really remind me of there is that when you work with some organizations, the difficult thing you have is when you're seeing MDs and board of directors, they're looking at the spreadsheets and they're seeing all the KPIs being met and all the targets being met. So you could have a very bad manager, but being successful in the eyes of the board or the owner or the CEO or whoever it could be, because they are hitting the revenue targets, they're hitting the whatever it could be. But the problem is, what they don't realize is actually they're leaving so much money on the table. Because if their managers are being charismatic with their staff, building those relationships, building better relationships with their customers, they will come back and pay dividends and so much more. I like to think of it like the bank. When you can't make withdrawal on an empty bank account. So think of those little moments you're talking about, putting the money in, saying hello, good morning, how was your day? Tell me about the kids, tell me about your life outside of work. These are making deposits in the bank. So eventually you might be able to make a withdrawal. That could take in the capacity of, I need you to stay back late tonight just to put this out. Or I really need you to push, the end of the month is coming up and I need a few extra sales, or whatever it could be. So these people in the places of power, they're not seeing this, and that's the disappointing thing. And that's sometimes the biggest challenge you have, just to change that that mindset.
Yeah, I'd actually take it a step further than what you're saying, actually, because for me, it's a short-term versus a long-term view. So, that manager, that hypothetical one that you've just described, yeah, they might be hitting the KPIs in the short term, but in the long term, if they're not building that relationship with their people, if they're not applying charisma, if they're not applying good leadership and so on, those people that they're working with probably won't stay in the organization for the long term, but also they're not going to perform as well. So you talked about the discretionary effort elements, but I think there's also, in the context of this idea of quiet quitting as well, there's the doing the minimum, there's the doing what you're required to do versus working that much harder because you believe in what you're doing, because you're supported by your manager, because you've got that good relationship. And so I think it's leaving money on the table, but it's a short-term view. It's not going to drive success in the long term. Absolutely.
And, some of the ways we can do that is what we kind of talked about there just now, the phrase like, I was just thinking about you. I was just thinking about you just there. And that just there just sparks that sort of that emotion that you have with somebody. Another thing you can look at it is something that's been called the friendship formula. Now, don't get bogged down in the friendship, because yes, of course you can make friends with your colleagues, but just look at the formula in itself, which is essentially frequency, which is how often you see someone, literally the number of times that you're seeing someone, the proximity, so how close you are to that person, duration, which is how long you're with that person on that basis, and intensity, Are you having deep, meaningful, good, engaging conversations with them? So frequency plus proximity plus duration plus intensity will equal a relationship. Now, of course, there's different factors varying there, but let's put that in the idea you give there, the bad manager. The bad manager who comes in, skips everybody, goes straight up and hides in his office on the top floor. Okay? They're not building a relationship with anybody, either the customers or clients. They're not having the frequency. Nobody sees them. Maybe they're working at home all the time and they're just out of sight, out of mind. They're not close. They're not in proximity. They're not visible where people can see them. Duration, they're not with them at all. And intensity, it's non-existent. So that's the example of bad one. We go into the good one. The good one's frequency. That's the every morning, good morning. It's the frequency. Hello, good morning. The proximity. Are they down on the office? Are they in the open plan office, able to see? Do they have their door open in the office that they work in? Duration. When they're speaking to people, is it long? Well, it doesn't necessarily need to be long. It can be long, maybe in a one-to-one or a meeting or whatever it could be, but it could be in short, multiple intervals, like that frequency. You can have one once a month, but it could be for a very long period of time. And intensity, are they having good conversations that are getting the dopamine flowing, they're getting the serotonin flowing? So these are things you've got to think about when you're talking about building relationships with managers, with colleagues, with staff and clients.
Yes, indeed. And if we could go back to my second point from earlier as well, because I think it's another issue that I'd really like to get to the centre of about, is it a skill or is it a natural talent, let's say? Well, what are your views on that with charisma and with leadership?
I'm completely in the camp of that. This is a skill that can be honed, it can be perfected, and it can be improved on. The Greeks, they taught charisma before they were taught philosophical and law and maths. They were taught a concept called rhetoric, charisma, persuasion. They were taught all these things because they had this idea. Then what's the point of being right in a debate when you cannot convey that you're right in a debate? So there's no point. And so you've got to bring it back down to this. What's the point of having all the great ideas if you can't convey them in the best possible way that gets people to buy in? So yes, there's people who are born and they just have that natural intuition for making first impressions, storytelling, confidence. Yes, there's those elements to it. However, if you were to break down those elements like storytelling, first impressions, conversations, these are things individually that you can improve on. Where that's having good conversations. Yes, okay, we take small talk and, how's the weather? What's your weekend? Of course, that's important. But are you able to scratch beneath the surface? Are you able to understand that when people light up on a topic that you've just mentioned, that you want to go deeper into it? So it's a real emotional intelligence element to it as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting, and as I say, parallels there to leadership as well. So where do you think this idea came from? Because I think it's become sort of a popular myth, isn't it? And where do you think this idea originated from, that it is a skill that people are born with and you either got it or you haven't?
Really, because the idea of charisma is quite hard to describe. Like when I was saying, what is charisma? I mean, what is charisma for you? Just tell me just now, David. No right or wrong answer. What is charisma for you?
Oh, put me on the spot there. I think it's a combination of things. I think it's likability. It's being able to be perceived as genuine, whether or not that's true, maybe a question for the individual. But it's the ability to get people to listen to what you're saying, I suppose. Yeah,
and once again, even though that's a really good response, you can ask several people and they would pick up different things to it. It's one of those qualities that we can't quite describe. We quite can't put our finger on, but we can tell when someone definitely doesn't have charisma. And I think there's all these other sayings that have compounded over several years. The idea of just be yourself, or you are who you are, or don't let anybody change you, all this. Well, that's all platonically good advice. But if you're somebody who's like, okay, I am who I am in my body every day, and I'm still not getting the success, I'm still not getting the promotion, I'm still not being seen as a trusted leader, what can I do? And it's not about changing your personality, and it's not about making something you're not. Back to the idea of authenticity and being genuine, but is it some skills that you can enhance to convey? Are you looking at your body language? Are you understanding your communication? the message that you're putting out there. So I think that's one element to it. And I think also there's an element of the media in the sense of that when we look at the charismatic people that we talk about, charisma is always put in the evil side. It's always put in the evil camp. Whereas if you look at, cult leaders, if you look at political parties, if you look at people throughout history, it's always seen as the evil people have the charisma, and then the good people have the leadership or the likability. And so it became a very muddied idea. So that's where I believe it came from. And this is just compounded over several years, and it's become instilled in us. And that's what I believe.
That's another interesting topic you've opened up there, actually. I think the Hollywoodization of it all, we could talk about that for hours on leadership or charisma. And I think maybe in the way they portray those things, I think actually a lot of the time they're portraying really the same thing. They're just giving it different names depending on whether it's the hero or the villain. Mm-hmm. But as far as, figures from history and associating that charisma with the more evil ones, I think this takes us into one of my, and I recognize it's probably a bias because of my past experiences, but one of my challenges, let's say, with charisma and leadership and whether people choose to follow a leader who is charismatic, for me, I feel like the charisma alone shouldn't be your primary motivation for following a leader. I feel that certainly in my experiences, in some of the things I've read from history, there are some examples that we're not naming, and mostly because I don't want to give them airtime. But I guess it's got to be, it feels almost like that can be sometimes quite superficial, and to attribute worth or value to a leader in terms of their vision and their purpose and what they're trying to achieve and what they're trying to lead you into, I think you have to look deeper than, are they charismatic? Do I want to listen to them?
Well, I think in an office environment and in a business environment, I think you're 100% right, because it's paper thin. It can be broken. No matter how funny your manager is, if they're not very good at their job and if they can't back up what they say, then no matter how funny they are they going to be the person that you're going to run into battle with? Not necessarily. And so you've got to look at these elements individual and say, okay, is this person? I think there's a few key elements I would throw in there. I think trust. Do you trust the leader that you have in front of you? Are they able to convey and communicate their ideas clearly, concisely, in a way that you can buy in and understand? Yes. Are they good at the job, or can you have that belief that they'll be able to achieve what they're saying that they can achieve? I think there's a few elements that will be specific to individuals that will go on a sort of on a bit of a spectrum. So that's kind of what I believe. But you're right, charisma as its own. And charisma is an element that's part of a bigger portfolio of skill sets that, when all applied, that's when the magic starts to happen. Because I believe that, yes, you can be charismatic and it will get you so far, but it will not be everything. However, as I'm speaking out loud, one thing I wanted to kind of bring your attention to was an idea around a career development, like in promotions. They were able to figure out that getting promotions was down to this element called PIE, P-I-E. And P was your performance, so how good you were at the actual job. That only accounted by 10% of why people get promoted, which maybe make you think, why? Okay, well, maybe that's why people get promoted and are terrible at their jobs. Maybe that's probably why. The I stood for image. How do people see you? Do people see you as someone trustworthy? Do people see you as somebody that's competent? Do people see you as somebody who can get stuff done? Okay, that counts as 30% of it. So for those doing the math at home, we're left with 60% left, which was down to your E, which was your exposure, which is, do the people who actually matter, who make the decisions, do they know what you do? Do they know you? Do they know exactly? If you're somebody who's the best coder in the world, but you're working from home, or you're in the corner when you're in office, you don't speak to anybody, you don't say anything, nobody knows what you do, nobody knows what, and we can all think of those examples of our head, like, what does David actually do? I'm sure we've all had those conversations with our colleagues. So that's why it's important to really emphasize, yes, okay, performance, it does count as 10% of it, how good you are at the job. But I'm sure we can look at examples where we've gone, look, people who are leaders, you don't need to be perfect at everything, but you just know what to do and how to adapt and problem solve in different situations. So I think that's a kind of a nice little poetic way to kind of summarize it. Yes, charisma is not the only element, but then just being good at it isn't the only element either.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think charisma is almost the vehicle to achieve those three things in a lot of respects, isn't it? I guess the problem I have with it is it's possible to apply it as a skill without having those things to back it up, but you will convince people and people will perceive you as having them if you don't. And I think the question of performance is really interesting as well. And also going back to, I know you said it almost jokingly when at the start of your answer there about you're not asking people to follow you into a war. I would say, like, the higher the stakes, the more important it is to have more than charisma behind it.
That's really interesting. You know, the higher the stake, the more important to have all the other key elements behind us is. Yeah, charisma is essentially tied into like communication. That's essentially what it is. It's tied into communication. So are you a good communicator? There was a phrase that came to mind when you were talking there, which was, you know, like a colleague, you're describing a colleague going, yeah, you know what, he's great down the pub. You know, I would invite him down to the pub, but would I trust him with this? Would I give him this job? You know, and these are the sort of things that I think of when you're talking about, you know, as charisma alone. Are you that guy down the pub that's fine, that puts the good vibes in the office, that's a big personality? Yeah, I'm sure you're very likable in the office, but when we think about leadership capabilities, are you also backing that up with what you say? You know, I believe that you can still convey leadership by being authentic and genuine, by saying you don't know something, you don't understand. You know, I'm thinking of an example of when perhaps, you know, it happened to one of my colleagues where, you know, they got promoted into a leadership role that they weren't qualified for, and there was somebody beneath them that was much more qualified. But in that first meeting, he just literally opened up and said, look, I'm here in this position, I'm going to be doing my best, I'm going to be doing whatever's right by you, but I will have to lean on David for help. I will have to lean on such and such for help, for their expertise and bringing their knowledge, because we're a team at the end of the day. You know, that would just inspire, you know, that would inspire anyone, not necessarily having all the answers. So I think there's a few different ways you can look at it.
I agree. I think I'm starting to see it actually as you're talking there. It's almost like the pivot point of all of those various different aspects coming together, isn't it? So, you know, yes, you mentioned trust earlier. I think credibility as well. Those are two crucial things. And yes, charisma can be a tool to convey those, to build those two things. And I think going back to our question right at the beginning about how do you spot the bad apple? How can you see through it if it's just charisma with nothing behind it? I think the answer is, as we've already discussed again, it's long-term versus short-term, isn't it? I think there's a lot to be said for applying all of these skills together. And the more important the conversation, the more important it is to do all of these things at once. And I also really like being honest about what you can and can't do. I think that's one of the big myths about leadership, isn't it? That the leader has to have all the answers, has to know everything. But actually, there is so much power in being able to say, look, I'm a human too. I'm not perfect. I'm going to make mistakes. There are things I don't know. And when I think back to my earliest exposures to leadership training, one of the biggest lessons that has stuck with me ever since, and it's one of the few things this particular organization got right, actually, without going into the history of it, but they always taught us, if you don't know the answer, say that. Don't try and fake your way out of it. But also, equally important, after the conversation's over, go away and find out the answer, and then come back to the person who asked the question and say, look, I've done some research. Thank you for asking. Thank you for raising this. It is important. Here's the answers I found. What do you think? And I think that it's all these, again, it's going back to those everyday leadership behaviors, isn't it? That you do throughout the working day that build up over the long term. And
yeah, you reminded me there of like the idea of, you said honesty, but in the sort of the charisma sphere, they describe it as vulnerability. You know, being okay to be a bit vulnerable with people, which is, you know, the idea of like, I don't know what the answer is, or yes, I made a mistake, or whatever it could be, because that humanizes us. It makes us much more relatable, and in turn, much more likable. You might find it sort of like counterintuitive, but people have a natural ability wanting to help people. And when they want to help people, they see the person as much more likable who they're trying to help. A great example of that is a psychological effect called the Benjamin Franklin effect, which essentially, if I ask you for a favor, you will feel more passion and enthusiasm towards me even though you're helping me. So I said, look, I really need a lift to work on Saturday. Oh yeah, of course. Like, you're wanting to feel wanted and appreciated. So that just reminds me of that little bit. So if you want to improve your charisma or improve your likability, don't be afraid to ask people for help. Don't be afraid to ask people for advice or ask people for their opinion. These are all things that will tie into the Benjamin Franklin effect, and in turn will help your charisma.
It's trustworthiness, isn't it? So similarly, one of the best ways, I think, to build trust is to display it. For two reasons. One, no one's really going to trust you if they feel you don't trust them. So if you can find ways to demonstrate you do, so much the better. But two, it does, if someone feels trusted to go and do something, that is only going to improve the relationship you've got.
Mm-hmm. And another one, just on the back of that, it might feel very simple, but an easy way that you can start building trust with people immediately is keep an eye contact. That's one of the main things, eye contact. When you have eye contact with somebody, it releases a chemical in another person's brain that's also known as the bonding hormone. It's called oxytocin. It's a bonding hormone. And that connection there with that eye contact helps to build trust. Another idea is basically just showing your hands. Having good hand gestures is a nice way to show trust. For those who have children at home, if they have something behind their back and you say, what have you got there? They say, oh, nothing. You really don't trust them. You don't trust what they've got to say or what they've got there, even if it could be nothing. And so just keeping your hands visible and just out in itself will help to build trust. It comes back to an idea of back in the caveman days, where I would have a tribe and I would see David's tribe walking towards me. I would look at his hands. Do they have a spear? Do they have weapons in it? Or do they have gifts, or are they empty? And I could be able to decide if this person's a friend or a foe. So it all comes back down to this. But you're right, showing displays of trust is a great way to give a green light that it's okay to do this.
From your work as a communication strategist, as an executive coach, I'm curious to know, where do you see communication and charisma overlapping beyond just the obvious ability to communicate your message?
Where does communication and charisma overlap? It overlaps in quite a few different areas. You can break it down in your personal and your professional life. In your personal life, we can talk about it. You're able to build a deep, meaningful relationship with your partner, with your friends, build a better social life. But even in your professional network, you're able to network much more effectively. You're able to build loyalty within your staff, your colleagues. You're able to increase your sales because you're able to build those deep relationships with your clients, and also inspire, invigorate everyone sort of around you. Conveying your message is obviously an important one, but also when it comes to building rapport, and building rapport and building relationships comes, I know that might sound quite broad, but building relationships in general is a huge part of it, because whatever industry you're in, I guarantee you that you're not in the space industry, you're not in the property industry, you're not in the tech industry, you're in the people industry, because people make the machine run, it makes everything happen. So if you're able to build those deep relationships with people by having good conversations, applying the friendship formula, showing good leadership, confidence, you will find that people will, it's strange to think of charisma as a productivity tool, but it is. You'll find that people respond to your emails quicker. You'll find that they'll show up to the meetings that you set. You'll find that they'll want to help you and do the tasks that you give them quicker and also faster and also before anyone else. So you don't need to see it as a productivity tool, but that's why I was going back to earlier when I was like, it's a job skill. Because we don't see it like that. But if people like you, people are more inclined to do things for you. And that in turn will help you either achieve your KPIs, get more sales, have better relationships, whatever it could be.
Definitely. Yeah, it's one of my big bugbears actually with I don't want to be unkind to accountants, but certainly the people who look at the bottom line in terms of the numbers and the spreadsheets, like you mentioned earlier. I mean, yes, those things are important. You've got to be able to measure the performance of your team, your organization. But ultimately, it comes back to the people. The people are the ones who are delivering those numbers. The people are the ones who are making those sales calls, who are looking after your customers, who are making sure that bills get paid and all these other sorts of things. So if you're not looking after the people, if you're not applying your skills of charisma and leadership in the correct and the adequate ways, then nothing else on your spreadsheet is going to be achieved. So Yeah, I totally agree with you. The bottom line is the people.
Yeah, and look, if you're somebody who's a managing position and feel like you're hitting your head against a brick wall because you're like the management staff are just not understanding this, you can use the metrics against them in a sort of way. If you're looking at like staff turnover, for example, staff turnover is a great sign of, okay, we need to do something about this. There's only so many ping pong tables and pool tables and afterward drinks that will get that. Ultimately, that's a big one. Basically 70% of people who leave a job is usually down to because they can't get on with their colleagues, they can't get on with their managers. So ultimately that's a really great idea to use to say, right, okay, this is something that's not working. Essentially it's difficult because going back to our initial conversation about there's bad managers there who are hitting KPIs but are leaving money on the table. So you've also got to look at, okay, what could we do to increase the bottom line? How are we going to make more money this quarter? Okay, if you look at it, adding charisma in terms of training, in terms of personal development and career development will have a higher ROI than hiring more staff or hiring more systems or implementing more procedures or whatever it could be, which are very technical. Just by increasing that alone, you'll start to feel there'll be an increase towards a better return on investment. So you can start to use those metrics against them in a sort of strange way.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think average cost of replacing one staff member who leaves, it's about 300% or more of their annual salary. So it doesn't take too many people leaving a team being run by a bad manager before that really stacks up. And even if you perceive in the short term, even that bad manager is performing well, is hitting the KPIs, I don't think it will take too many people leaving before that KPI is lost. You're not getting that return at all, because how many salaries does it really take to add up to that financial performance? That's going to change depending on the industry, depending on what you're selling, of course. But I think it is still an important metric, as you say, to fight back with. Yeah. And I think there is a movement, isn't there, these days, certainly in the last few years, given Great Resignation and COVID and all those other things, and the shift we've seen in office cultures in particular. There's this movement towards, just because you've got a high performer, if they're still toxic to your team or your organization, it doesn't really matter what their performance is on paper, because their overall effect on your business is going to be negative.
Absolutely. It just comes along this concept. But even if you're somebody who feels like you don't have enough resources, you're like, I need more resources, I need more this, I need more that. Just by applying charisma in itself is so impactful. They did a study out in America over the postal service over Christmas. They took a load of temps in the postal service and they put them into 3 categories. And they basically, with category 1, they just basically let them do the job as normal. Category 2, they put in cash incentives. And number 3, they had nothing except each morning they would give a charismatic speech. And they studied the performance of all the temps. And ultimately, the people who just got on with the job came dead last in terms of efficiency, performance, retention, all that jazz. Category 2 was the charismatic speech. So you might find that's a little bit, underwhelming. It should be number 1. However, number 1 was the cash incentive, but only by a margin of 3%. So actually, you could save so much money in terms of incentives, commissions, money, in terms of staff salaries, just by having this charismatic attribute, whether that's in the form of a speech, a meeting, an email, a person there, whatever it could be. So actually, it has a huge return on investment. But obviously, part of the persuasion is making people see that as well.
That is interesting. I wonder what would happen if they did both.
Well, in which case you go hit the room. But if you think of it, let's bring it. We talk a lot about leaderships, but let's bring it back into the individual perspective. If you're someone sitting there and you're incredibly frustrated because you haven't got the promotion or you want a raise or whatever it is, people who are on par, more likable, have a higher emotional intelligence, more charismatic, earn on average about £25,000 or $29,000 per year more than people who are perceived as unlikable or have a low emotional intelligence. So back to the idea of, okay, what's in it for me? What's the skill that I'm getting? Yes, conveying my message, but actually just by improving your charisma by a couple of points, you're actually able to start to earn more money because people see you as more likable, more employable, more trustworthy, all this sort of stuff.
And the further you get in your career, the more important that becomes.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, we've spoken about it already in the context of looking for promotions, but once you've got that promotion, I'm coming around to the point of view now. I think, it is a key skill for leaders. I might have to add it to my list.
Well, look, the idea is also you can talk the talk, but you also have to walk the walk. You know, I always think examples of people who are like, oh, David, the company director, he's so good, so likable, so charming. But like, if you keep breaking your promises, or your body language isn't saying what you're saying, like isn't conveying what your words are saying, it will eventually fall down, and people stop believing it. So it goes hand in hand. Yeah,
definitely. I think. I mentioned honesty earlier. You talked about it in the context of vulnerability. I think it's two sides of the same coin, but I think one is very, very personal, the vulnerability, and speaking to the authenticity of it as well, and sharing more about yourself, which I think is a very modern approach to leadership. It's certainly not something we would have seen even 20 years ago as a widespread approach. And then there's honesty, which I think is perhaps wider. It's about the context of the business as much as it is about you as the individual leader. And so if you don't do these things right, if you say something that isn't true, so let's say someone asks you a question about the performance of the business and is their job safe, and your natural instinct, of course, is to say yes, absolutely, because you're scared they're going to leave if you say no. But if that's not true, if there is an issue and you lie about it, eventually they'll find out, probably sooner than later, because as we talked about earlier, people are pretty good at seeing through that kind of lie when the context around them says something very different. So it's really in your interest to just be honest in those kind of situations. And I've picked an extreme example to make the point, but I hope you get what I mean.
No, absolutely. But and those little white lies, add up. Like it doesn't need to be that, but it could be, as we said, you're doing great. You're doing great, but the person's maybe not performing like they should be. It doesn't mean you have to crush their souls, but you have to be honest and upfront with them. At the same time, if somebody is performing well, but maybe their head's in the sky, they also need a reality check as well. So charisma can be a really a powerful skill in the arsenal of a good leader. And so I think that's the best way to look at it. It's giving you an edge. It's giving you just a little bit extra.
Yeah, it's a good way to describe it.
It's quite funny because sometimes charisma, we talked a lot about it in the professional life, but also it's something simple. It's being asked to that dinner party because and all your friends are excited to see you when you go to the barbecue, or the barista in Starbucks gives you a free coffee because you come in and you give them a bit of chat. It's all these little things that can add up.
Yeah, I don't know that's ever happened to me in Starbucks. Does that mean I've got a charisma problem or?
Well, maybe you need to start speaking to your barista more. Maybe it's not just about the flat white or the latte, and maybe give them a bit of chat. But it's a great, it's a great exercise. It's a great exercise if you're someone who's a little bit naturally awkward or naturally reserved, or somebody who's like wanting to test the waters a little bit. These sort of situations, you've really got to grab with both hands, and just try it. I give the example of it's like, charisma is a lot like stand-up comedy, in the sense of that you have to practice in public and perfect in private. Chris Rock, as an example, he cannot just go on in front of millions of people and everything he says funny. He spends 12 months going around all the rubbish comedy clubs, and one man and his dog, practicing everything he's doing. He doesn't know it's funny until he's out there performing it. And the exact same with charisma. You don't know if it's working until you're having those conversations, having those moments with people. And then if it's not working, okay, you come back, you reflect, you try to improve upon it, and then you go again.
Don't be afraid of it blowing up in your face occasionally, I suppose, while you're practicing, to use the Chris Rock example.
Yeah, exactly. And it's one of those things where it's just like, if when you start to feel like rejection's kind of part of it, not rejection, they won't like you necessarily, but just things might not go to plan. You feel a little bit of comfort in it, and confidence comes with competence. The better you become at something, the more confident you are at it. So that's why it comes with a lot of practice. Back when I was in the motor trade, the salespeople who always struggled were the ones who didn't stick it long enough because they weren't They just didn't have that practice. They hadn't put the reps in. And you could say the same for new leaders who are incredibly anxious right at the beginning because they don't have all the answers. They don't know what they're going to say when someone says X, Y, and Z. But the longer you're in that situation, the more you deal with those scenarios, the more confident you become.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I love the confidence comes from competence. That's something that the old cliche of practice makes perfect. Yeah. I don't know if there is anything that will ever be perfect. I'm a realist in that regard, but certainly if you don't practice, you'll never be perfect. So there we go.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I love the Starbucks example actually, because anything where you can find a relatively low risk way of practicing a key skill, I'm all for that. So good example.
Yeah, use the technique of using your environment around you to say things. So in Starbucks, they'll have Italian roast coffee, and you go, Italian roast coffee. Have you ever been to Italy? And oh yeah, I went to Italy, and you know what I mean. It's just something as simple as that. Use your environment around you. Or in Starbucks, they have the machines, the massive machines there. And I go, how much do those machines cost? I heard they cost £20,000. What is it? That much? That's like the same as a Nissan Micra or whatever it could be. And then you get into your conversation, or whatever it is. So you don't be afraid to use your environment around you to help you initiate conversations with people.
Yeah, that's great advice. Yeah. As long as they don't think you're casing the joint, asking about what things.
Yeah, where's the safe? What's the pin code?
What sort is it? I'm an enthusiast.
Yeah.
What would you say has been the biggest leadership lesson that you've learned in your career so far?
That's a fantastic question, because there's so many mistakes that I can look back on and say, okay, I should have done this or I should have done that. I think for me personally, when I was just starting out my career, I always believed that the harder I worked, the more time I put in, the more better I became at my job, the more success I would have. And that was probably something that I look back on and thought was a little bit naive, because I didn't understand office politics. I didn't understand networking. I didn't understand, not being friends with the boss, but having a relationship with the boss. And I think it was only after making so many mistakes and getting frustrated by the fact of why is my ideas, which are good, never getting taken seriously? Or why am I never getting the promotion that I wanted? Or why was I never getting the acknowledgement or the credit that I felt like I deserved? Because I put all my eggs in the idea of if I just become really good at this hard skill, if I become a really good coder, then people will be able to naturally see that. And whilst that can happen, on the basis that a lot of it comes down to communication and being able to communicate your thoughts, your ideas, your concepts, and what you actually do on a day-to-day basis to somebody. Someone could think back to the idea. Some people in the office, even though they sit next to each other, don't know what the other person does. And I've seen it before. They go, I don't know what David does, and he sits opposite me in the open plan office. Or I actually don't know what that department do. So that was something I really made a real big error in the beginning. And when I became an actual manager, I think I really struggled with the blurred line of friend and manager. I think because I was a friend in the circle that I was in, and then when I became a manager, I felt it was a really difficult transition for me, where I felt like I was no longer part of the office gossip, because they were talking about decisions I made. Back then, I would if the manager made a decision that I didn't like, we'd all go to the staff room and we'd moan about it or complain about it. But I wasn't getting part of those conversations anymore. And so there was an element of kind of letting loose of what people thought of me, which was a really difficult thing to do, because naturally I was insecure. I wanted people to like me. I wanted people to buy into my vision. And so that was a real challenge that I had when I was first becoming a leader. And eventually, over time, over your belief, over the decisions that you're making and standing by them, feeling that you're doing it in the best interest of the team, in the best interest of the company, as long as you have that behind you, you always felt okay, well, you know what? With the information I had at hand, with this idea of acting in the best interest of other people, being sincere and genuine. Hey, listen, if it's the wrong move, I'll put my hands up and go back to the idea of authenticity or vulnerability. Sorry. You don't have all the answers. You're not going to know everything. It's not all going to be a number one hit single. It's not all going to be a home run. So I think that was a real learning curve for me.
Yeah, that transition moment is really challenging, especially if you're being promoted in an organisation where you've already worked for quite some time, as as you've just described. And I think there's, I don't want to diminish the experience, but I think it's one of the most common challenges that new managers face in that context. And it is such a difficult thing to overcome, especially if you really value those friendships and you feel like they're at risk and that you're even damaging them, perhaps through no fault of your own necessarily. So yeah, I completely empathise with that.
Yeah, it was a real big one, and now one that I suppose I've come to terms with. And I think you're right. If you're moving from organisation to organisation, it's probably easier because there's almost a clean slate. Like nobody really knows you, and so you can kind of reinvent yourself a little bit. But you have had that history. People think you've changed, or people think you're not who you are, or you used to be one of the good ones, now you're not, or you're part of the evil corporation, or whatever it could be. And back to that saying, I wanted people to like me. I wanted people to hang out with me. I had this sort of insecurity. So yeah, over years of just trying to have that belief, it kind of sort of diminished. There's still elements where you kind of doubt yourself, but I think that's really natural, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's. I think ultimately it's just about accepting that those things are outside of your control. You can't control whether someone's going to like you necessarily in that sort of context, at least.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think a lot of people, it's part of their work identity, isn't it, to rebel against the man, to fight the boss, so if you suddenly become that manager, then nothing you can do about it.
Yeah. 100%.
Yeah. I think one quite useful approach, though, is to have that conversation with them early on and just say, look, I'd like to be friends outside of work if we can, but this relationship at work has changed now, and here's my expectations, what are yours? And open that dialogue up and apply that skill of charisma to make the best of it that you can.
Absolutely. I love that.
On that note, what advice would you give to one of those new managers who's maybe finding it difficult to make their voice heard in their new role?
I think your early days as a manager, it's really important to not necessarily go in hard and make all the big changes and implement all the big ideas. I think it's really important to understand the team that you have, understand the personality of the team, try to understand what makes them tick, and understand what they are. They used to call it love languages, but I believe love languages could be applied even in your professional life. What gets them excited, what makes them tick, what are their rewards or their affection capabilities are. I'll go into a little bit of detail about that just while we're on that then. Basically, your love languages, that they believe that there's 5 love languages. So if you ever wonder why your partner is angry at you, is maybe because you haven't quite understood their love language. And love language can take many different forms. It can take the form of, compliments, affirmations, saying, oh, you did a great job. I really liked your work on that project. People are really going to get their juices flowing because you've just said that's it. But for some people, that might not be their thing. They might see it as like, yeah, whatever, yeah, great, I know I did. So you've got to really understand what people's love languages are in the office. Another one could be gifts. Gifts like, hey, you did a great job. Here's a bottle of Prosecco, or here's the flowers, or here's the bits of chocolate, For other ones, it's service. So here, David, you did a great job on that report the other day. Tell you what, I'm going to drop you off at home tonight, or I'm going to give you a lift to the football game, or I'm going to do this for you because you've done X, Y, and Z. So I really understand what these things are, because what you'll understand is that if you don't know what they are within your team, you'll start to find that there'll be a little bit of a disconnect, and then you'll find that you'll do things, you'll get angry at your team because you're saying, oh my God, like I have bought all these gifts for people for doing a good job and they don't appreciate it. And you'll get angry at them, but they weren't looking for that. That's not their love language. Their love language was just being told that they had a good job. So really being able to understand this, I think, is a really key element. So those early days, really have conversations, not necessarily about work, but about personal life, what they're getting up to, their passions, their interests, their family, and really try to build that deep connection with them really early on.
The way I like it, I've heard it described that I really like, is you need to get to know the whole person. So I think there's absolutely, as a manager, as a leader, you need to understand what makes people tick at work. You need to know how they best work, what their preferred method of communication and feedback and all of those things are. But you also need to know what makes them tick as a person. What do they do outside of work? What are they interested in? I'm not so sure how I feel about the whole gift giving thing. I feel like that can be a bit transactional sometimes, but if it's part of a wider picture, then I guess I'm not against it.
Well, usually a great example of that is when you've hit like a milestone. So the common one is like, hey, David's been here for 50 years. Here's a watch. That's kind of the common times we see it. Also in sales, we see it in terms of incentives. They use it as incentives. So like, okay, David, you've hit the target. Here's a bottle of Prosecco, or here's 2 tickets to the football game, or here's whatever it is. That's another time you see it. But for other people, it can be, can it be transactional? I don't believe so. I believe it can be a form of showing appreciation, the same way that a husband will buy his wife flowers, the same way that a husband would buy a diamond ring, the same way like it can have a degree of like emotion attached to it as well. I think if you're buying everybody bottles of Prosecco, then that's it. But the idea is try to tailor it to the person here. A great example was years ago, when I was working in sales, they had this incentive where if you sold the most, you'd get Enrique Iglesias tickets. And this was a group of middle-aged men who had no idea who Enrique Iglesias was. However, if we were a load of middle-aged women, it would probably have been the best thing that you could have inspired us with. So, that's talking about like really know your audience, I guess. So it can be different for different people. In personal lives, it's like cooking a meal for each other. Cooking a meal is a sign of affection, or saying I love you. So yeah, it's things like that, really getting to understand it with people,
Yeah, fair enough. I guess it's perhaps more about me and what my language is, doesn't it? But
well, yeah, true. I mean, there's lots of them. There's really strong people to look into them because it's, yes, don't be put off with the fact it's a love language. It's initially done with partners, but it can absolutely be applied to members of your staff and your colleagues.
Yeah, I guess that at a core level, it's about knowing your people, isn't it? Which has to be the responsibility of the leader. A good leader, anyway.
Absolutely.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, I think hopefully this is going to be a slightly more difficult question for you, but let's find out.
Oh, wow.
If you could start your career or your business over again, is there anything you would do differently?
Yeah. I think for me, I'm not too sure how this might apply into the leadership role, but for me, I had so many false starts. I would start something, give it a go, and realize that was a wrong route to go down, come back, rechange it, adapt it, then go again, and then again, when really what I actually had to do was not think about the product, not think about the service, not think about that, was just think about how can I help people? How can I help people? What is the person that I'm trying to help, and what can I give them that I know is that they're going to leave here absolutely jumping? And then whatever that is, do that, as opposed to thinking of this $1 million idea, this doggy poo bag that will fold itself or whatever it is. Yes, it might be a great idea, but actually who's that actually trying to help? So I think for me a big thing was just the false thoughts and just not really caring about the person that I'm actually trying to help at the end of it all. I was just conscious about selling the thing. And we bring it back into the motor trade, you're just like, right, how do I get the car out the door? How do I sell the car? But not thinking about the person that you're actually trying to work with, which might sound really obvious, but I guarantee you the entrepreneurs and the managers on there aren't thinking like that. They might believe they're thinking like that, but they're not genuinely taking the time to really think about how you can help them. And I think maybe if you tied it back to leaders, like you think about how can you help your colleagues? How can you help your staff? How can you help your clients? That's kind of how I think about how can you do that. So that's one thing I would do again. If I had to do it all over again, really just forget about all the bells and whistles, forget about the glamour, forget about any accolades or any appreciation. Just think, how can I help this person? And really just try to get your value, your self-worth in the satisfaction of being able to help them.
I think the other aspect of it, you mentioned about having the false starts. I mean, I think that does equate to leadership in the respect of it's important not to be afraid of failure, but also to make sure you're not building that culture of fear of failure, because failure will happen, mistakes will happen. But if you're the sort of leader who punishes that, then yeah, I mean, we go back to all the other things we've talked about really, but I guess for me, it's about you're missing the opportunities for learning, aren't you? About whatever it may be, whether it's your leadership approach or whether it's about how you can best serve your customers or how you can create the right environment for your people to succeed. And ultimately, if you're not open to productive failure, let's call it, you're going to end up in a situation where people are afraid to tell you when things have gone wrong. And that, I think, is the worst place for a leader to be.
I really like how you've swayed that answer into that, because I think that is really true. The false start element. Look, in the charisma world, how we discuss it is like, you're not going to win every single person over. Not everybody is going to want to be your friend. Not every single person in the planet is going to want to immediately spark an interest towards you, and that's okay. There's plenty of other great ideas. There's plenty of other people. The idea is to cut it, move on, and get on to the next person. A great example to use is like to make someone fall in love with you. We've kind of gone on a bit of a strange tangent, but to make someone fall in love with you, it's much easier just to move on to the next person. If someone doesn't love you, David, if someone's like, "No, David, you're just not the guy for me," it's much easier for you to go, "Okay, let me go find someone who is the person for me," rather than trying to convince somebody to love you for all who you are when they don't. So that's the idea that I would give.
Yeah, it reminds me of the sunk cost fallacy. How many people just keep going and going, "I've spent this much money and this much time up to this point. If I leave now, it's all wasted." And you can apply that to so many things, can't you? I mean, sales, your career, like if you're in the wrong job. I know that's one I've done.
Yeah. Well, look, it happens for different. It's easy for me to say that it happens at different people at different sides. But come back to the idea of practice in public, perfect in private. So don't be afraid to try and do it, because you're going to have to. Because theory will only take you so far, and when you do it, you actually see the components in the machine work. And if it's not working, come back, reevaluate it objectively, and then try to go again. And yeah, okay, there will be an end date where you feel, okay, we've exhausted it, or we feel like we're not doing it. But ultimately, if you feel like you're not enjoying that process of tinkering, if you're not really enjoying that process of going to market, going to the person, going to whatever it could be, failing, coming back and trying again, then do it. There's terrible football teams out there. There's football teams that lose every week, but they can still get 11 players to show up. How do they do that? Because they love the process, they love the game, they love it. And so the idea is not to find your satisfaction in the money or in the accolades or it's to find it just in the satisfaction in yourself.
Yeah. Although in the footballer example, I'm sure the money helps.
Yeah, 100%. I'm sure that sweetens the blow a little bit.
Absolutely.
Leadership heroes.
Well, I've only got one question left for you. This is my favourite question as well, so let's see what you come up with. It's called Leadership Heroes.
Okay.
The question is, if you had to pick one person, and they can be alive or dead, past or present, real or fictitious, who in your opinion would perfectly embody leadership, who would that person be and why?
Oh, that's such a good question. Such a good question. My mind's racing through all the people that I think are leaders. You've obviously mentioned a few great leaders. Sometimes I want to go to like the pharaohs, like the leadership that you hear with the pharaohs with building the pyramids and all that sort of stuff. Sometimes I want to go to something really obscure, maybe like a fictional character like Sherlock Holmes. That was one that kind of came to my head just there. But for me, somebody that really embodies leadership, I have always been a sports fan and an athlete, so it might be cliche to say, but for me, a real a leader would be Tyson Fury, who is the boxer in the UK. He is the heavyweight champion of the world, also known as the Gypsy King. And I love him not only for his charisma, but just how he leads his team of his, nutritionist, his coach, his all that jazz, but also how he leads his family as well. He comes from a traveler background. And there was one time in the documentary of his life where his partner was like, "I'm going to pull my children out of school. They're only 6 years old. I'm going to pull them out of school and I'm going to homeschool them." But I was actually going, "No, that's not right." Even though that was our life and our path, we don't want that for the children. I think that showed the elements of real leadership, because I can think of so many men to say, happy wife, happy life. But I think there's elements like that I'm like, okay, he's showing real characteristics of leadership. But also I think he's just naturally a very charismatic, the sort of what we idolize as a charismatic person, the big personality, the jokes, the laugh, the singing, all that jazz. So for me, it would have to be Tyson Fury.
Well, that's a very interesting pick that we've not had before. I do like your rationale behind it. I haven't seen the documentary and I don't know that much about him, but I'll add it to my watch list now that you've said this.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely.
Yeah.
It can be a little bit wild sometimes and
Right.
ostentatious and crazy suits. But for me, I'm always attracted to characters. I'm attracted to people with personality, people who are different, people who are quirky. And that's just something I've always been. If you look at my friendship circle, you know, it was never been the classic cool kids. It was never the classic sport kids. It was always the in-betweeners. It was always the mixed bag of people because they told the best stories. They told the best story. They had the best experiences. And so, yeah, I think I've always been naturally attracted to these just really quirky people.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's certainly a big character in a big
literally,
industry,
yeah. Yeah, like 18 stone geezer, yeah.
Yeah, but he stands out in an industry full of those kind of characters, doesn't he? Because, I mean, obviously, I don't follow boxing or any of that sort of stuff, but I know who he is. I couldn't name you even 2 or 3 others in that environment, so I think that speaks a lot.
Yeah, he's been able to try to transcend, but he's also had the mental health aspects and things like that. So he's really been a pioneer in certain elements to it. So yeah, I think he's a really interesting character.
Yeah, and I like the story as well about the kids in the school. And I think it's a very fine line to walk, isn't it, for leaders between breaking with tradition, but for the right reasons, and having that ability and courage of your convictions to do that, to go against the flow, but for the right reasons and ultimately in the right decision, which I suspect that probably was.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I always that came to me was like being able to pick your battles, which is a skill in itself. You know, being able to know when to know you're not going to win this one, and to know when to stand up and fight your corner. And I think if you genuinely believe it, you've got information, you're backed by the practice, the skills, and all that jazz. And I think in that situation, he was able to. He probably felt that was the right thing, and he wasn't going to be able to be moved on it.
Yeah, I suppose he's had to get quite good at picking his battles, given what he does for a job.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, but it's good to see people being able to take those kind of skills and approaches and mindsets and apply them across their lives as well as just their profession. So, yeah, really good pick. Thank you. Well, Sebastian, it's been great talking with you this morning. Last thing, if any of the listeners would like to learn more about you and what you do, and I'm sure they would you like to point them towards website or podcast or anything else?
Yeah, absolutely. So the best place to go is to go to my TikTok page, which is just Art of Charisma. I've got over 200 videos of really snackable, bite-sized tips and advice to improve your charisma. But if you really want to delve into it, you can go to just artofcharisma.com. There you will find literally pages and pages and pages of blogs to really just get your teeth stuck into to really start to improve it. And if you do want to go to the next step, of course, you can schedule a discovery call with me there. And that's really the best place. But if you do have any burning questions, just write me an email, artofcharisma@outlook.com.
Lovely. And I'll put links to all of those things in the episode description so everyone can find it easily. And that's all we've got time for. Thank you again so much for being with us today.
Well, it's completely flown past. I've had a great time. So thank you for those amazing questions. And I'm hoping that people listening will be able to pick out a gold nugget from what we've talked about today.
I'm sure they will. And yeah, it's been great talking with you today. So thank you again.
No problem.
Thank you again so much, Sebastian, for your time this morning. Really enjoyed that conversation, as I always do. I know, listeners, you're probably tired of me saying that, but I did find this one particularly challenging because obviously I had preconceived notions of charisma and how it applies to leadership. And I think Sebastian has done a really good job there of explaining it in a way that actually makes sense to me, I hope to you listeners as well, and putting it in the right context when it comes to a skill and how it can be applied for better leadership. So listeners, if you have enjoyed today's conversation, you would like to learn more about Sebastian and what he does, all of the links that he gave us just now will be in the episode description for you to find easily. So I do encourage you to click on one of those, reach out, get in touch with him. He's a great guy to talk to, and I'm sure you'll learn loads from that interaction. If you are a new manager and this or any of the other issues we cover in this podcast is something that you are struggling with right now, then I also encourage you to get in touch with me. You can do that either by LinkedIn, my link is in the episode description as well, or by visiting www.leadernotaboss.com. Thank you for listening and being with us today. I hope you'll join me again next week. And in the meantime, as ever, remember, be a leader, not a boss.